The world's equilibrium cannot be maintained forever, and Noland almost broke the balance. Roger was the one who ended up breaking the equilibrium, but had he experienced what Noland did, then he would not have become Pirate King. Noland angered the gods and was killed for his transgressions against the heavens. You think I'm lying, but it's true. I think Noland would have made it to Laugh Tale if he were a pirate, but the reason he was killed was because he wasn't a pirate. So let's talk about why Noland could have been the main character of One Piece. And if you're new to my channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. Noland defied the Skypian god Kashigami, and maybe the series of unfortunate events that followed after could be seen as an act of God retaliating against Noland, but it wasn't random. See, Noland went to Jaya on an exploratory mission but ended up executing a god and liberating a land oppressed by a false belief in an illusionary god, not realizing he returned to a world oppressed by a much more insidious power. In a way, Noland believed in the wrong gods and would have lived if he were a pirate. Let's take a look at his more successful counterpart, Roger. I think Oda purposely gave us the direct comparison of Noland to Roger. They had a lot of the same attitudes in terms of adventure. In a lot of ways, Roger was more of an adventurer than a pirate. If we were to boil things down, Noland was a really strong botanist with a boat, and Roger was a really strong geologist with a boat. It's funny because at the end of the day, Roger was just a guy looking for rocks. And at the end of this video, I want to lay out a really funny parallel between Roger and Noland that's based off of my Mad Tale video that I put out earlier this week. But continuing with more of the parallels, Roger became a world famous pirate and Noland was a world famous adventurer. Both of them by the end of their stories were executed in their hometown, where both of them were forever imprinted on the history of the world. Technically, neither of them died because none of them were forgotten. More than the surface level parallels, both of their descendants suffered the same way. Cricket and Ace both were incredibly burdened by their family history. Both of them lived to overturn the legacies left by their ancestors in a certain way. Both Ace and Cricket were bullied in their youth about their ancestry, directly and indirectly, which forced them both to set sail to make their own legacy. But Ace at the end of the day wanted to make someone else the Pirate King to overwrite the history of the first Pirate King, Roger, whereas Cricket wanted to overturn the popularized story of Noland to prove that he was right, not because he was doing it for Noland, but rather to finally clear his own name and his own future. Both of them shared the exact same burdens, but from completely opposite angles. Though both of their ancestors were world famous, Noland's was through humiliation, whereas Roger's was through demonization. They both had the same exact last words, but yet there was a specific difference. See, Roger died proclaiming a great treasure existed somewhere called the One Piece, whereas Noland died proclaiming a great treasure within the great city of gold, El Dorado, existed. They both even named their treasures that were the end of their recent journeys. So you could say Roger would have been a better YouTuber than Noland because I'd probably click on the One Piece over El Dorado. No offense to Noland. But that's not the only reason why I say there's a difference. It all comes back to being a pirate. See, at both of their executions, neither one of them had proof or could substantiate their claims, but yet they both died completely different deaths. But look at what happened at Noland's death. For some reason, they set up Noland with a random dude there to testify against Noland and to break his truth. Is that a coincidence? No. That's something that is planned. They brought up a fake crewmate of Noland's to essentially crucify him and make him a martyr. Why did they need to include this person? The kingdom already knew Noland was a liar. Sure, the citizens may not have fully believed it, but the king was there. He saw that Noland was a liar. What more would he need to want to execute him? But then, even more than that, Noland went down in history as a liar, so much so that there were books written about him slandering his name and butchering his true story. And those stories persisted through generations, even until Cricket, which, by the way, historical propaganda is a signature mark of a certain entity in One Piece. But you're probably by now like, okay, what's so special about this story? I knew all of this already. But again, let me ask you, who really killed Noland? Was it the king of Louvniel? Was it the Skypian gods? Was it Noland himself? Was it the knock-up stream? The correct answer is the knock-up stream, right? Because had that not happened, Jaya would still be on the Blue Sea and Noland wouldn't be a liar. But it's actually deeper than that. In fact, I think Noland was scheduled to die the moment he landed on Jaya. So let's walk back Noland's story a little bit with more details. So in the year 1122, Noland becomes the first intruders to land on Jaya and visit Shandora in 400 years, according to Kalgara, which is an important note. But fast forwarding through Noland's story, we get to an interesting panel here. After Noland and Kalgara become homeboys for life, Kalgara brings Noland to Shandora, where he basically says the treasure isn't the gold, it's the bell and the poneglyph that were held as the real treasure, so Noland's crew can take all the gold they want. During the crew's search, they stumbled upon two things, an eternal pose and a map of Jaya. Kalgara says we must have taken that from invaders. Well, wait. That's really weird. Didn't Kalgara just say no one has visited the island in 400 years? So how did the intruders that never made it to the island have a map of Jaya? On top of that, the map has the hidden city Shandora mapped out on it. So again, if there were no visitors to the island and the Shandorans were largely isolated, how does an invader have a map like this if no one has been to the island in 400 years? Doesn't that mean this map is from the Void Century? And it's one thing to map out the outside, but the inside of it too? So who could have had this map? Well, we were given another clue. Along with it was an internal pose, and I'm assuming it's of Jaya. And guess what entity has the ability to take away log pose characteristics of islands and create eternal log poses without even being on the island? The world government. So those intruders might have been people in search of Shandora on behalf of the world government, and this gets amplified by something we find out a little bit later in the Noland story. So Noland leaves Jaya, right? The knock-up stream happens and Jaya's in the sky. And the rest is history, right? Wrong. That's not all that happens. So Noland goes back to Louvniel country and informs the king about Shandora, the city of gold. The king becomes entranced in the story, and then 5 years pass. And we see the king talk to Noland saying they have finally gotten permission from Merijois to enter the Grand Line. From who? Yeah, the Holy Land, Merijois. But on top of that, Noland is appointed to be the admiral of the exploration ship. But the king says none of Noland's crew can come, and it's going to be the king and his soldiers. That's a very odd thing. Knowing how perilous the trip is, why would the king go himself? But also, without the crew that made it there the first time. Does that seem like something you'd order for an exploration? I mean, in our history, let's think of Spain, for example. When they granted permissions to explorers like Columbus, it's not like the kings and queens would just go on these expeditions too. And Noland's story seems heavily tied to that of Raleigh, a man who wrote exaggerated stories of El Dorado, the city of gold. And the story shares a lot of similar elements to Noland's. But that being said, the setup for Noland's adventure back to Jaya was already sabotaged at the start. He didn't have his crew and had to protect the king. Their fleet lost ships on the journey, and Noland even says we'll never survive with such hastily trained soldiers as a crew. I've got to at least keep this ship that the king's on afloat, to the death if I have to. So it's reasonable to assume that had not Noland been the absolute legendary beast of a man, this was a death trip. Noland and the king should have died, but Noland pulled through for him to get to Jaya and see that it was gone. And the king was not happy about Jaya being gone. So then they return back and we see the staged execution of Noland, where the fake crewmate basically crucifies Noland. So if you can get the feeling already, this series of events definitely was not instigated by the king of Louvniel. Rather than the king, remember what I said before? They had to get permission from Merijois before this trip. So let me just give you a timeline real quick. Noland lands on Jaya in 1122, and he makes it back to Louvniel the same year. 5 years later, in 1127, Louvniel and Noland were approved to re-enter the Grand Line to see Jaya. And 1 year before, in 1126, is when the knock-up stream happened, shooting Jaya up into the sky. So let me ask you something. Isn't that another insane coincidence? Noland had 5 years back, and it just so happens that it took 5 years to get approval for this trip, and the year before they get the approval, the knock-up stream happens? No, that's not a coincidence. But if you don't agree yet, let's add some details. Do you know what happens every 4 years in the One Piece world? No? Well, it's fine, because I do. It's the Reverie, which I have a big note about at the end of this video. But yeah, the Reverie happens every 4 years in the One Piece verse, which given that since there were 5-year delay in Noland's trip, that means there was a Reverie in that time. And actually, we can calculate which one, and in two ways. Well, one, right now, the current year in the One Piece verse is 1524. And so that means the Reverie that took place was in the year 1124, which is exactly 400 years ago, which also means it was the 100th Reverie that happened before the current time, which, if you can't see why that's important, let me fill you in on that blank Reverie. That's probably when the king of Louvniel went to get the approval at the Holy Land. He had to justify this expedition somehow, which brings up an important point, at least more prevalent in the past, countries aligned with the world government had to get approval for expeditions within the Grand Line? That's a very interesting thing, especially considering it's not like they gave any help. It's like purely regulatory. A point I'll bring up in my Void Century video that's coming up soon. But so this situation reminds me of the current Reverie. I don't imagine the King of Louveniel would bring this up at the round table, but somehow it would need to get approved. And at the current Reverie, Nefertari Cobra requested a special audience with the Gorosei, and this is their response to that. After clarifying what the Nefertari's relation is to the world government, they said, "Has he cottoned onto something? Let us pray it does not derail the talks." Even here, they are worried about certain information going public, and without spoiling, we see with the current manga just how much the Gorosei try to manipulate the media. So then with the King of Louveniel, I'd imagine a similar circumstance, except the Gorosei were probably way more on top of their game back then because there was a lot less things going on. So they set up a full plan to counteract Noland. They approved of a voyage that was destined to fail, as they were the ones who probably said it has to be the king and Noland who went on this trip. That was probably meant to wipe them out. As a failsafe, just in case they made it back and forth from the trip, they set up a false testimony to make sure Noland would go down in infamy. But not just that, they didn't stop there. After Noland's execution, books were released that further spread the word of Noland, which when you think about it, right, Noland was a world famous adventurer who probably inspired other adventurers, and that is probably what the world government wanted to diffuse. And they used Noland to deter others from wanting to be an adventurer by pushing the agenda that being an adventurer isn't that great, and the greatest adventurer was full of lies, which is the exact same situation Roger had. They wanted to deter more pirates from completing the full circumnavigation of the globe, but the difference was Roger was a pirate from the start. He chose his execution and his death, and so they didn't expect the exact opposite to happen, where rather than lowering people's motivations to become a pirate, they gave Roger the perfect stage to spark the great pirate era. But at the end of the day, both were demonized thereafter by the world in various ways. But you're probably like, wait a second. ParVision, you missed something. Are you implying that the world government also is the cause of Jaya going into the sky? In other words, the knock-up stream. And I mean, the shoe kind of fits, doesn't it? Let's think about this for a second. When Kalgara and his tribe experienced the knock-up stream, it was for the first time, it seemed. But to reinforce that point, Noland was on Jaya for at least 1 month, and we know the knock-up stream happens 5 times a month. That means if the knock-up stream existed like it did in our current time, Noland would have seen it at least 5 times, to the point where whenever we see the knock-up stream, it's literally a giant water laser beam that you really can't miss from the island. And Cricket was able to even track it, but we have not heard a single peep about this knock-up stream, nor the Emperor Cloud that Skypiea was on, as it would bring night during daytime, another very interesting point. So, despite all of that, we have no record of either. And you know, if you were a native to a land that commonly had giant laser water beams off the coast, that's something I would inform my new best friend, like, hey buddy, if you come again, just be careful of it turning nighttime randomly during the daytime, or sometimes the ocean decides to yeet anything nearby. But yeah, so now there's 2 points with this. We know the knock-up stream can move, but from our knowledge at this point, near Jaya, the knock-up stream did not exist 400 years ago. But it conveniently did right after a reverie where a king might have unintentionally alerted the world government that they stumbled upon Jaya. Thereafter, not 1, but 2 major coincidences lined up. The first one is not only did the knock-up stream happen conveniently right before Noland's return expedition, but it was pinpointed on Shandora to the point where Cricket never mentioned a knock-up stream that was off the coast of modern Jaya, where Shandora would have been, which kind of implies that the first knock-up stream was targeted, which is an incredibly crazy detail. If the Gorosei can control the knock-up stream, maybe that's why it took 2 years after the reverie to be able to activate whatever mechanism is behind the knock-up stream. Cricket gave us a soft theory of how it works. He says there's an enormous cavity beneath the sea, and through a fluctuation of cold and hot water, it creates a giant steam pressure thing. But the issue with this is, why does it move? Also in a semi-predictable pattern. This implies that it's not a geological occurrence, but something else. But we still don't have enough info on this. I mean, at one point I was like, what if it's just a giant whale or something? And I did catch on to a really interesting connection relating to snakes, but I'll save that for a smaller knock-up stream video. That being said, let's look at this from a different angle then. What was the result of the first knock-up stream? The first knock-up stream completely wiped an island or part of an island off the map entirely. Isn't there another place that we know of that the world government has claimed to have just disappeared from the map? Yeah, that would be God Valley. What if this is how the world government managed to wipe it from the map, and God Valley was the second place if there weren't more in between that this weapon was used against? But there might be a huge difference here. See, there were two coincidences, not just the knock-up stream hitting Shandora, but also the Emperor Cloud being positioned perfectly to catch Shandora. What would have happened if the cloud wasn't there? Wouldn't the entire island just crash back into the ocean and be destroyed? Maybe it even split up? Maybe something like the place on Balloon Terminal was God Valley. Maybe that's why we saw Kaido there at his introduction? But I'm just throwing out an idea. That being said, the movement of the Emperor Cloud is very interesting because it seems like it might migrate, and I wonder if it can be controlled. Maybe that power is Uranus? That sounds crazy, but I'll explain what I mean by this in a future video. So at the end of the day, I think it's a fair assumption to make that the Gorosei proactively took out Noland, like they should have done to Roger. He survived their perilous trip, they shot the knock-up stream possibly, but then after they set up and forced the execution and the slander thereafter by propagating the news of Noland the liar, which again is their signature mark of manipulating the true history of the world. So now I want to add on some additional thoughts to this line of thinking. So a theory that I was formulating while I was making my Vanderdecken video, the Mad Tail thumbnail video, is that maybe there are other paths to the true history other than studying the poneglyphs. I think each generation there is some sort of trend that the Gorosei have to smother out in order to conceal the void history. See, in the line of thinking that the Gorosei used the knock-up stream to hit Shandora, I was thinking, isn't that way too aggressive? I mean, they didn't even do that with Ohara. But with Ohara, it was a bit different because they needed to destroy the knowledge to read the poneglyphs, knowing that they couldn't destroy the poneglyph itself. They had to confiscate it instead. But what's weird is that reading poneglyphs seems to be a trend in our timeline with Rox, Roger, Ohara, but with Noland and Luvial Kingdom, they shouldn't have had any worry about them reading the poneglyphs. So that's when I realized something really interesting. The trend in Noland's time wasn't reading poneglyphs or pirating, it was simply adventuring, and a line stuck out to me. Kalgara's daughter asked who Noland was. His crew responds, "He's an explorer. He's famous in our kingdom. He's also a botanist. He goes to uncharted islands all over the world, discovering new varieties of plants and studying them, and there are plenty of explorers that have interest in plants. It's an important role in any country." And I was like, wait, it's an important role in any country? That's interesting because we don't have any notable people in our timeline besides Heracles and Torino Kingdom that has a significant interest in botany. It's even more interesting because in my recent videos, I highlighted the increasing thematic when it comes to nature, Green Bull's powers, the forest god possibility, Emu also being in the Chamber of Flowers. And so I was thinking maybe the world government during Noland's time used Noland as an example to deter other people from becoming adventuring botanists just like they did with Roger and pirating, but failed, whereas with Noland, they succeeded. But even more than that, what if they did that because they were worried someone stumbling upon the Void Century through means that are unconventional to us but would make a lot of sense for the story? So the idea that poneglyphs aren't the only ways to learn the Void Century is actually supported by Roger. With the voice of all things, the poneglyphs may not be the only way to learn the Void history. Think about it. We have an example in story of someone learning about the Void Century without the glyphs. It's Momo. And not through Odin's journal, but instead Zunisha, an entity that existed in the Void Century, has told Momo key details about Joy Boy and associated details along with it. Zunisha itself is essentially a walking poneglyph. But then what about the Sea Kings? They seem to be knowledgeable about Noah and the ancient past and ancient clans, and Shirahoshi and others can hear them. But imagine if Shirahoshi just asked them about the Void Century. I'd imagine they would know a lot. So here's another example of how someone could learn of the Void Century without poneglyphs. So why is this relevant to this theory? Well, let's bring it back to botany. Through studying botany, is there a way someone could reach the truth of the Void Century? Well, actually, there's a huge one, which is devil fruits. I would imagine if you had a peak scholar like Professor Clover, but instead with botany, they would be able to crack the code of devil fruits, and who knows what truth that would unlock since we are 1053 chapters into the story and still have no clue about devil fruits. So there's that, but there's something even more vital. So there is something else special about Shandora or ancient Jaya that it might also have in common with a few key places, which is graveyards. Specifically on Shandora, there was the forest of the ancestor trees. Kalgara's daughter says the souls of our ancestors who had died on this island over the past several centuries are said to dwell in them, guided there by the sound of the bell. They are white, holy trees. All of our ancestors who lived on this island ever since the age of Shandora watch over us from those trees. To us, the Shandians, the forest of the ancestor trees was something precious, even sacred. We protected them as we would our own lives. This thematic is something that actually is in common with a lot of the islands that are special to us, like Fishman Island, Zo, and Wano. Wano, for example, has all the samurai, even Ryuma, buried and somewhat preserved with the internal graves. But that being said, another interesting note about the forest of the ancestors on Jaya is that they are white holy trees. I'm going to make a video in the future about the color white in One Piece. I mean, it's really crazy, like the white holy trees and then sun god Nika's form, and then also the white boars on Wano being the agents of God. But aside from all that, if this were really the case with these ancestor trees, that they actually house the souls of the ancestors from the ancient Shandora, then this is yet another way that if you had the voice of all things and were researching plants, you could maybe end up hearing the souls of the trees and they could tell you the true history of the world, which might be what the Gorosei were afraid of rather than Noland finding the poneglyph and reading it, because at the time it wasn't really known whether many people knew the text since modern Ohara didn't exist and Wano was closed off, which also makes me wonder if Brook could interact with the souls of these ancestor trees. If another similar situation shows up, maybe Elbaf will have more information in a similar form like a graveyard. But by now, you're probably tired hearing all these offshoots of this Noland idea, but it's literally never ending. There's still more. So to cap off this ancestral talk, it's interesting because Shandora had these pure white holy trees creating the forest of the ancestors. Fishman Island had the forest of the sea, which was blessed with life, but was the graveyard for all the ships that have sunken throughout the world, which is super interesting. It says all of the ships. And the land is apparently really fertile, indicated by the whale's presence. The Minks also had an ancestral land, but also have the Sulong form that when they're in the visual sight of the full moon, they access their ancestral memories and become full white. Then on Wano, we have the Ringo graveyard, which has a bunch of weapons as tombstones essentially, and it's covered in white snow. Then with Sun God Nika, there might be another ancestral connection there with the pure white form. So that was an idea, but what I thought was more important was this next part. It seems like right now there's a common theme of the Gorosei burning things down that they don't like. Ohara got buster called and burned to the ground. Then we're still unsure of what happened to Okio Kingdom, Nami's place of origin, which seemed to share a similar fate, but also the kingdom is Tokyo Kingdom just backwards, so it shares a similar thing as Elbaf being Fable. But also this is another direct connection to Japan, so maybe somehow they're related to Wano. So it makes you wonder, is this part of their method of the Great Cleansing in this era? And it makes me wonder even more, what did they do back in Noland's time? And that's when I thought of two things. Tree fever could have been a way the world government was instigating a great cleansing back in the day. The way Noland's right hand described it was that it ravaged and destroyed many small kingdoms and islands. The other part of this line of thinking was, how did the forest of ancestors' holy white trees even get infected? According to Kalgara, they were isolated for 400 years with no visitors on the land. But somehow their most important section of forest got infected with an illness that was widespread outside of the island, which kind of implies that there was some sort of external interaction with Jaya. Or it could simply be a coincidental spawn of the exact same tree fever that Noland experienced outside of Jaya, which is a little weird. But so let me get something out of the way before I get to Noland's name stuff. So this is a really funny thought that I had. So I always joked about how it's funny that the world government demonized Roger as a pirate king, but in reality, he was just a man looking for rocks on islands. And the funny connection is that Roger's rival's name is Rocks. And this joke will be even funnier if you watch my Mad Tail video about the Mushroom Pirate King, which inspired this video actually. But so if Noland was Roger's predecessor essentially, but rather than researching rocks, Noland was a botanist that studied plants, what's really funny is that I found definitive proof that Vanderdecken, the original one, was probably a Kinokobito, which are a race of mushroom people. So that means Noland's rival, had he had a fuller life, might have been a mushroom, which is ironic since he was a botanist, similar to the naming pattern with Roger's rival Rocks. And now that I brought up Vanderdecken, I think a slight addition to the previous theory that I want to make is that I think the original Vanderdecken might have been searching for Shandora, or El Dorado possibly, learning the news from the Reverie where Louvniel Kingdom would have divulged the information, but also maybe they just heard it from Noland's book. The last line in Noland's book said he theorized Jaya sunk, which is why Cricket was diving in the ocean to search for it. And it might be that Vanderdecken did the same thing, as part of his introduction song was saying that he was looking for sunken treasure specifically. Now, to finally cap off this Noland video with some ideas that might give some clarity to his name. So I think even if some of this theory is true, it makes a lot of sense that rather than pure misfortune, Noland was instead a victim of the schemes of the Gorosei, which might sound odd considering the current sentiment that they are incompetent. But when you look back at Noland's story, it really does make sense that the Gorosei had some involvement in his demise, which makes it feel like they gave Noland the D-Clan treatment by demonizing and slandering them. It's also so crazy that it just happens that 100 reveries ago was perfectly timed within Noland's story for this story to be implemented. Like, this is honestly sort of a laugh tale when you think about it. Once Cricket learned the truth of Noland, he couldn't help but smile and cry, just like Roger did at Laugh Tale. But speaking about the Reverie, I was invited to this year's Reverie, Reverie X, hosted by JD Legend on July 8th, which I'm really hyped for since I didn't even have my channel when the last Reverie happened, and here I am. Along with that, I will be hard pushing my backlog of theory videos that I have been talking about for a while. The next 2 weeks will be filled with exciting videos, so if you like this video so far, please like, share, and subscribe. Mainly share, to be honest, because when I tell you the upcoming Void Century video is absolutely bonkers, and it connects back to all of this, and I'm not exaggerating. Well, in general, most of my theories connect, but yeah, I can't wait to connect with you all through the Reverie, which is so exciting. But anyways, continuing on with the other connections. I think Noland was actually a D-Clan member, which is something I was hinting at throughout this entire video, making his name possibly Noland D. Mont Blanc, which would make his name share a similar system as Trafalgar D. Water Law. In Law's name, the D referring to the D-Clan obviously, but Law had said that the water in his name is his secret name that was kept for generations. Similarly, maybe Noland's secret name is Mont or Mountain, which might have made him an even bigger target. And there's another connection to that white theme that I was talking about earlier. His name is Mont Blanc, or White Mountain. And what's interesting is just like gold, including the D in his name made his name more convenient, like how Noland is No Land, which fits the liar No Land story. But Noland D could also make a lot of sense. So Noland is a more common name with Irish roots, which if you were in my last Voice of All Things stream when I talked about a possible relation of Laugh Tale and Ireland, which you can go back and check or wait for a future video if I have time for it. But anyways, apparently Noland's Irish meaning would be champion, which fits Noland really well because I think he was a champion. But in general, I think hidden names are going to play a huge role in the upcoming story, and it might be relevant to Wano as well. So White and Tsunachi are two major hints of the focus of my next two major videos. In conclusion with Noland though, I think his major issue was that he worked with the government in his good nature, when the world that he lived in did not value free growth. In a lot of ways, the world government is looking to maintain the equilibrium, and so balance breakers like Noland, Luffy, Robin, Ace, and Roger are threats just by their pure potential. If Noland just sailed freely like Roger, then the world government would never have known about this expedition, and maybe he would have lived to turn the world upside down by finding Laugh Tale 400 years ago. And I hope I turned your world upside down. I think there was more to cover regarding Noland despite how little info we got. There's still the segment about snakes that I'm holding on to, but my goal with the Vanderdecken and now Noland video was not necessarily to prove my theories correct, but rather bring these neglected pieces of information back to the surface that may be relevant for the last saga. And given Noland's mysterious continued relevance to the story, I think some of these details might actually come back in full force. Like the mystery of the knock-up streams. If the Gorosei control it, then that is huge. But also Noland liberated the Tontada in his time, and not too different than Luffy. And more than that, Oda actually made Noland relevant again through the Road to Laugh Tale Volume 1 release. He mentioned that the last lode poneglyph could be on Vera, which was an island liberated by the Revolutionary Army, but also this kingdom was introduced to us through the Noland story. Apparently he visited them 2 years before Jaya and learned about Sky Islands from Vera. The fact that Oda even included Vera Kira in the Road to Laugh Tale drop just tells me how Oda does have plot points that seem so obscure to us, but they might be even more relevant than we realize. And in that regard, I think my channel is one of the best places to find the craziest connections. So I appreciate all of you who are tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this Noland rant. If you love One Piece and want to see endless One Piece conversations, join my Discord or keep an eye out for my streams, because somehow I just end up endlessly talking about One Piece all the time. And if you want to support my channel, please check the links in the description box below. It really helps a lot. But more than anything, hype me up at the Reverie and share my channel. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.